Three wet women stand on a platform in the rain, wearing defective tags around their necks. No one has been able to sell them all day, and then a beggar bastard with a hole in his cloak and 9 copper coins in his pocket raises his hand. He is the only one in the whole city who knows that he is not buying defective goods, but 3 fortresses locked away. And just a week ago, this bastard was dying. Rain Ashgrave opens his eyes and stares at the ceiling of rotten planks. The smell of wet straw and someone else's sweat hits his nose. His body won't obey him. His arms are skinny, his ribs stick out from under his skin like needles. He sits up and nearly falls backward from hunger. The last sound of that life still rings in his head, the beep of the monitor, the chart on the screen. Plus 4,700%. Then darkness and a blow to the forehead against the keyboard. But that was back there. Rain Ashford, 38 years old, hedge fund analyst. The one who bought up assets the market had turned its back on, held on, waited, and rose to the top when the rest realized they'd been blind. And here, a rotten ceiling and a stranger's body. 24 years of someone else's life lie in his memory like a report read in a single night. Bastard. Rank F. 0 mana. A skill called appraisal. A trash skill for a trash person. That's what the orphanage director said every morning while handing out soup. That's what the orphans said as they snatched his blanket away in winter. In the world of Aelion, rank decides everything. The right to land, the right to marry, the right to look a nobleman in the eye. F rank has none of these. F rank sweeps the floors and dies quietly. Rain stands up. His legs are shaking. He walks over to a crack in the wall and looks down at the city of Calderon. Stone roofs, smoke from chimneys, the temple tower on the hill, and somewhere beyond the rows of shops, the square this body remembers, the moon market. Today is the last day of trading. The great houses dump there those they deem unfit for marriage, daughters with defects, women with sealed manna, those whom the temple empty. They are put on the platform and sold for pennies to those who cannot afford a normal marriage contract. The buyer gains the status of a husband, the seller is rid of the shame, and the women who are bought disappear after a year or two, quietly, without a trace. And this is where the strangest part begins. The old Rhine used to look at that platform and be glad he hadn't ended up there himself. The new Rhine looks at it like an analyst, and he feels that cold chill in his chest. The one that used to come over him when he saw an asset at rock bottom, when the whole market was screaming junk, when investors were running so fast they were dropping money on the run. That's exactly when Rain Ashford bought. Not when things looked pretty, when it's embarrassing to stand nearby. He counts the coins in his pocket, 9 dimes, his entire net worth in this world. He doesn't smile. You can't smile before a purchase. A smile at the start means you're trading on emotions, not numbers, and Rain trades only in numbers. He pulls the hood of a stranger's cloak, taken from a corpse 2 years ago, over his head, and heads down to the square in the light, cold rain. The appraisal skill always works, quietly, in the background. Numbers float above every person, not rank, hidden debts, panic level, probability of bankruptcy. A useless skill for anyone who doesn't understand what these numbers mean. But Rain has understood them for 38 years. The square is almost empty. The auction is over. The crowd has dispersed. 3 women with marriage tags around their necks are getting wet on the platform. The first is tall and angular with short, wet hair. She stands straight, chin up, weight on her front leg, shoulders back, fingers slightly bent. A body that was trained from childhood and then broken. Numbers above her. Rank on the tag, C. Real potential, SSS. A blood seal has been imposed from the outside. Reason for the lock? Her home. Rain's breath catches. Not from surprise, from recognition. This is how a company is deliberately bankrupted so it can be bought out for pennies. This is not a defective woman. She is a fortress locked tight. The second one is small, with a long black braid. Her head is bowed. Her body is tense. She isn't afraid. She is waiting. She's used to expecting the worst and just stands there. Numbers above her. Rank D. Potential SSS. A seal on the spiritual channel. The temple of the morning dawn. A purification ritual. Rain clenches his teeth. The third stands motionless. Silver hair, eyes of different colors, skin pale to the point of transparency. She doesn't tremble. She doesn't avert her gaze. She looks at the world as if through glass. Above her are numbers, rank, potential, nothing but question marks. The evaluation can't read her. In 38 years on the market and 24 years in this world, this is the first time Rain has seen an asset that the skill won't pick up. It's either rock bottom or the absolute ceiling. There is no third option. The auctioneer yawns in the rain. The crowd jeers that the buyer should pay extra for such people. Someone throws a cigarette butt. It hits the first one in the shoulder. She doesn't flinch. Rain counts. 9 copper coins. 3 contracts. 3 copper coins for each. The price of dinner at a cheap tavern. The market has written them off completely. He raises his hand. The auctioneer blinks, looks again. Rain names the price. 9 copper coins for 3 contracts. There are no other buyers. The hammer falls. 1, 2, 3. The crowd doubles over with laughter. A lowly bastard from the orphanage bought 3 defective wives for 9 copper coins. Joke of the year. Rain isn't smiling. He walks up to the podium and takes the 3 scrolls. Marriage contracts under the law of the 3 moons. A man may take up to 3 wives if each brings a decent dowry. Here, the dowry is 0. But the law doesn't specify a minimum. A loophole. One of thousands that Rain dug up over 2 months when the memory of the new world had settled and he began to read. He tucks the scrolls into his inner pocket, neatly, corners to corners, just like he used to fold reports before the board of directors. 3 women are looking at him, the first with hatred. She's waiting for a blow and already despises whoever delivers it. The second with fear. She's waiting for an order and already submitting. The third looks right through him as if through glass. Rain says one sentence. After there's a roof and the rain doesn't get in, and he's going there right now. Not an order, not a promise, just information. The first snorts, the second nods, the third blinks. They follow him, not because they believed him, because the platform in the rain is worse than any roof. He leads them to his little room. 1 bed, 1 chair, 1 window. Rain points to the bed. Sleep here. The first one looks at the bed, then at him, then back at the bed. She's waiting for a catch. Rain takes a thin blanket from the chair and lies down on the floor by the door, so the door can't be opened without moving him. Not to lock them inside, so no one can come in from outside. He puts himself between them and the world. Literally, physically. The first brick of trust. The 3 women huddle in the corner of the bed and silently watch the executioner, who suddenly lay down on the floor and closed his eyes. But his mind is working. The tax collector will come in the morning. 3 silver coins for each wife, 9 silver coins. Rain has 0. If he doesn't pay, the contracts will be canceled and the women sent to the royal mines. That's death in 6 months. So he needs money by morning. Rain goes over in his head everything Otsenka saw over the past 2 months, every face, every number, and she finds it. A dwarf jeweler in the 3rd row of shops, a hidden debt of 14 silver, license expired 6 days ago, high panic. And in the display case, a ring everyone considers a reject, a dull stone in a cheap setting. But the assessment showed otherwise. It's not an opal, it's a moonstone with a crack running down the center, and the crack isn't a defect, but a natural cut under the influence of water. The ring isn't worth 2 silver, 20, if sold to the right buyer. House Velinor. The heir was born under the sign of water, the ceremony on the new moon in 6 days. Rain lies on the floor with his eyes closed and smiles, not with his face, inside, that place where a single faith has lived for 38 years. The bottom is not the end. The bottom is the entry point. Something happens at night. Rain wakes up from the heat. His body is burning. His bones are twisting from the inside. Blood is flowing from his nose. He presses his sleeve against his nose and sits up. Words hang before him in the darkness. The Lunar Union system is activated. Host identified. Connection established. Connection level 1 out of 1,000. Progress recorded. Rain reads this 3 times, wipes away the blood, lies down, thinks. A new variable, the system, the union, the connection. He doesn't know yet what it means, but he knows one thing. The market has confirmed the position. When you buy at the bottom and the system generates metrics, it means the asset is alive. It means the bottom was real. That means growth will begin. The only question is when. And when it comes to waiting, Rain is the best. In the morning, he gets up before dawn. His body is shattered. His head is heavy. But something new appears in his perception. The air has become slightly denser. The world has become slightly closer. +1 to mana perception. First income from the position. Meager, but not 0. Rain looks at the bed. The first one is sleeping on the edge, facing the door. Her right hand under the pillow is clutching something, a knife or a shard or her own fist. The second one is curled up in the middle, knees to her chest. Even in her sleep, she takes up as little space as possible. The third lies on her back with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. And Rain isn't sure she was even asleep. Rain left the shelter before the sun had risen above the rooftops. His body ached after a night on the stone floor. The nosebleed had stopped, but the taste of iron still lingered in his mouth. He hadn't had breakfast. There was nothing to eat. The third row of shops began beyond the temple square. At this hour, the shops were still closed. The shutters were down. Only cats roamed among the barrels of rainwater. The gnome jeweler's shop stood at the end of the row. Narrow. The sign was crooked. An unlit lantern hung above the door. Rain stopped in front of it and activated Assessment. He didn't actually turn it on. Assessment was always on. He simply focused his attention. Numbers appeared above the shop. Hidden debt, 14 silver. Pawn license expired 7 days ago. Yesterday it was 6. Today it's 7. Panic level critical. The gnome was inside. Rain saw a heat signature through Assessment. He hadn't slept all night. He was sitting behind the counter. Rain knocked. Silence. He knocked again. The door opened a hand's width. A face appeared in the crack. Broad, bearded, eyes red from sleeplessness. Above the gnome's head, numbers flickered that only Rain could see. The gnome's name was Braun. Age 142. For a gnome, that's middle age. Jewel crafting skill, A rank. Appraisal skill, B rank. Debt to the Jewelers Guild, 14 silver and 2 copper coins. Overdue on his pawnbroking license. If he doesn't settle it within 5 days, the guild will seize the shop, the merchandise, the tools, everything. Braun looked at Rain, and his face expressed what faces usually express when they see a rankless bastard in a tattered cloak at 5 in the morning. Nothing good. Rain said he hadn't come to buy. He said he'd come to make money. For both of them. Braun started to close the door. Rain managed to say 3 words. Moonstone. Crack. Braun stopped. The door froze. Rain said there was a ring in the display case that Braun considered a reject, a dull stone in a simple setting. Rain said it wasn't an opal. It was a moonstone with a crack running through its axis, and the crack wasn't a defect. It's a natural cut for water mana. The ring isn't worth the 2 silver pieces listed on the tag. The ring is worth 20. Braun was silent. His hand on the door was trembling. Rain continued. He said that House Velinor was looking for a water mana artifact for the heir's ceremony. The ceremony is in 6 days on the new moon. The heir was born under the sign of water. They need exactly this kind of stone, with exactly this cut, and they'll pay 20 silver without haggling because time is working against them, not against the seller. Rain proposed the terms. He finds the buyer. Braun handles the transaction through his license while it's still valid. 20 silver, split evenly. 10 for Braun, 10 for Rain. Braun pays off his debt to the guild and has some left over. Rain settles his matter and they begin a business relationship. Braun opened the door. He let Rain inside. The shop was small and smelled of metal and polishing oil. Shelves lined the walls. A display case by the window. Tools on the workbench. Braun took out a ring. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at Rain. He asked how a lowly boy knew the difference between an opal and a moonstone. Rain replied that it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was right. Braun could check for himself. He needed a drop of water on the stone's surface. A moonstone would absorb it in 3 seconds and give off a blue sheen. An opal wouldn't. Braun dripped the water. The stone absorbed it in 2 seconds. The sheen wasn't blue. It was bright blue. Braun raised his head. His hands were no longer trembling. An hour later, Rain stood at the gates of the House of Velenor estate. He was not allowed inside. Entry is forbidden to those without rank, but he passed a note through the gatekeeper, a short one. A moonstone with a natural water cut, ready for the ceremony. Price, 20 silver. Braun's shop, 3rd row of shops. The gatekeeper looked at the note as if it were dirt, but he passed it on. 2 hours later, a carriage bearing the Velenor coat of arms pulled up to Braun's shop. 20 minutes later, the ring was sold. 20 silver coins were placed on the counter. Braun counted out 10 and handed them to Rain. Rain took them, silently, calmly, as if this were not the first major deal in his new life, but the 1,000th. Because that was exactly the case. The number had changed, the amount had changed, the principle remained. He left the shop and headed toward the temple square. The tax collector was already waiting, a short man in a gray cloak with the treasury's coat of arms on his chest. Above his head, the assessment read, corruption level, medium, propensity for intimidation, high, personal debt, 2 silver. The collector saw Rain and his face broke into a smirk. He said that the marriage tax for a commoner was 3 silver per wife, 9 in total. Deadline, noon. Fail to pay, and the contracts are voided. The women will be sent to the royal mines. Rain took out 9 silver coins. He placed them on the table, in a neat stack, coin by coin. The collector stopped smirking. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected tears, pleas, begging for an installment plan. Rain looked at him and waited. The collector counted it over, wrote out a receipt, a stamp, a signature. The contracts were confirmed. Rain took the receipt and left. 1 silver coin remained in his pocket. The first item was settled. The cash flow was open. Now home, to his wives. He had 3 potential SSSs there on the cold floor of the shelter, and one of them definitely hadn't eaten in at least 2 days. He bought food at the market. Not a crust of bread, not scraps. Proper food, fresh bread, cheese, dried meat, apples, a pot of porridge with honey. He spent 4 copper coins from his change. When he entered the room, the 3 women were sitting exactly where he had left them, on the bed, in the same corner. The first one was sitting upright, staring at the door. When Rain entered, her body tensed. She was bracing herself. Rain understood exactly what she was bracing for, and from that realization, something cold stirred inside him. He set the food on the chair, the only chair in the room. He said it was breakfast, and that he would step out for 10 minutes so they could eat in peace. And he left. He closed the door. He leaned against the wall outside. 10 minutes. He stood there and listened. The first minute was silent. The second minute was silent. In the third minute, a sound. Quiet, cautious. Someone took the bread. Then another sound, and another. They were eating. Rain closed his eyes and exhaled. When he returned, the food was gone. All of it, down to the last crumb. The pot was licked clean. The apple cores were gnawed down to the seeds. 3 women sat on the bed and looked at him. Their expressions hadn't changed. The first with hatred, the second with fear, the third right through him. But something had shifted imperceptibly, by a millimeter, by the thickness of an apple peel. Rain sat down on the floor by the door, crossed his legs, looked at them, said his name was Rain, that he knew they didn't want to be here, that he knew they expected the worst from him, that he wasn't going to explain anything right now because words from a stranger were worthless. But he was going to do things, and they'll see. The first one snorted, asked what things. Rain answered, "First, find a place to live. Not a room and a shelter, a home. Then clothes and shoes, then figure out what happened to each of them." The first one laughed, short and sharp. She said he'd bought them for 9 pennies, and he had no home and no money, and he was F rank, and he was going to figure out what even entire houses hadn't been able to figure out. Rain nodded, said she was right on every point, except one. She didn't know what he could see. The first one fell silent. She didn't understand what he meant, but something in his voice made her shut up. Not a threat, not force, something else. A confidence that needed no proof because it was proof in itself. Rain spent the rest of the day in the city. He walked the streets and watched. The assessment ran continuously. He gathered data. Every merchant, every shop, every house, debts, connections, needs, fears. By evening, he had a map in his head, not of the city. He knew the city from the memories of the former Rain. A map of cash flows, who owes whom, who fears whom, where the bottlenecks are, where he could wedge himself in. He found 4 people in the city of Calderon who had problems that Rain could solve. Not with magic, not with a sword, with information. The baker on Old Wall Street owed the miller, but the miller owed the tanner, and the tanner owed the baker. A triangular debt. Classic. Each of 3 suffered separately, unaware that their debts could be settled in a single meeting. Rain arranged the meeting. He sat between them on a bench by the fountain. He explained. The 3 men looked at each other, then at Rain, then at each other again. Half an hour later, all 3 shook hands. Debts settled. Rain didn't ask for silver for his service. He asked for 3 things. From the baker, bread every morning for a month. From the miller, a sack of flour. From the tanner, 3 pairs of shoes, women's. In the sizes he estimated by eye, because he'd been watching the feet of 3 women as they stood on the platform and had memorized them. Otsenka remembered everything. He returned to the shelter when it got dark. He brought the shoes. He placed them by the bed. 3 pairs, not new. The tanner wouldn't have given new ones for the mediation, but sturdy, clean, the right size. The first one looked at the shoes, then at Rain. Her face didn't change, but she took a pair, tried them on. The size fit. Her eyes were different for a second, for just a second. Then they closed again. The second one took the shoes silently, pressed them to her chest, as if they weren't boots but something alive. The third one looked at her pair for a long time, lifted one boot. She sniffed the leather, put them on, wiggled her toes inside, and for the first time in 2 days, she looked up at Rain, not through him, at him. Rain lay down by the door. There was no fever that night. The system was silent. Connection 1 of 1,000, progress recorded. He lay in the dark and counted. 1 silver coin in his pocket, minus food expenses. Tomorrow he'll need more. The day after tomorrow, even more. In a month, he'll need a house. In 3 months, he'll need land. In a year, he'll need a position from which he can't be budged. But right now, 3 women on the bed. Each has shoes. Each had a hot dinner. None stood in the rain. None were on the platform. A small base, ground zero, a foundation on which to build. On the 4th day, Rain found a house. Not a mansion, not a manor. A stone ruin on the outskirts of Calderon by an old wall. 2 stories. The roof is intact. The walls are thick. Windows without shutters, but with glass. An overgrown yard. A working well. The former owner had died 6 months ago of a fever and left no heirs. The house had passed to the city magistrate and stood empty because the neighborhood was considered bad, and buying here was beneath the dignity of any decent townsman. The appraisal showed structural condition, grade B, hidden water source under the yard, fertile soil within a 50-step radius, potential with investment, an average house or a small estate. Current market price, 2 silver. Actual value with minimal repairs, 12. Rain bought the house for 1.5 silver. He haggled with the magistrate's clerk for 20 minutes. The clerk was glad to get rid of a useless asset on the books. He signed the papers so quickly that the ink hadn't even dried by the time Rain left the town hall. Rain spent the rest of the silver on the bare necessities: soap, rags, a bucket, candles, groceries for a week. He hauled all of it halfway across town by himself, all alone. 2 trips. His back ached. His hands were shaking. An F-rank body wasn't built for physical labor, but Rain carried on and didn't complain. There was no one to complain to. When he brought the 3 women to the new house, they stood at the gate and watched. The first one walked around the house. She checked the walls. She peeked into every room. She felt the latch on the door. She did it like a warrior surveying a position. Rain noticed and remembered. The second one entered quietly. She pressed herself against the wall by the entrance. She stood there for a minute. Then she slowly walked inside. She looked around. She found a corner by the hearth. She sat down there, as if she had found a place where she could breathe. Rain noticed and remembered. The third one entered last. She stopped in the middle of the main room. She placed her palm on the stone wall. She closed her eyes. She stood there for 5 minutes. Rain didn't rush her. When she opened her eyes, they were a slightly different shade. Her left eye had grown lighter. Rain noticed and remembered. For the first week in the new house, Rain worked, from dawn till dusk. He cleaned, he washed, he mended, he patched the leaky roof, he fixed the door hinges, he chopped wood, he hauled water from the well. He did everything himself and didn't ask for help. Not because he didn't want to, because it was too soon. You can't ask for trust. Trust must be earned through action, consistency, predictability. Every morning he got up. He lit the fire. He put the porridge on. He laid out the bread from the baker on the table. He went out into the yard. He worked. He returned for lunch. He worked again. By evening, he brought something back: food, fabric, a single thread and a needle. Rain noticed that Yuna's second wife was looking at the torn curtain the way a person looks at a problem they can solve. He left the needle and thread on the table next to her. He said nothing. In the morning, the curtain was mended, neatly, with tiny stitches. Yuna sat in her corner by the hearth and didn't look at Rain, but the curtain was whole. It was the first sign. Not trust. No, it was a long way from trust. It was concern. Minimal, almost invisible, but it was there. Rain left more fabric on the table. By the end of the week, all the curtains in the house were mended, and an embroidery appeared on the second-floor window. Small, a flower. Yuna didn't admit it was her, but no one else in the house knew how to embroider. Rain appreciated the work. Attention to detail was A rank. Handicraft skill was B rank, a suppressed skill. She hadn't been taught. She'd taught herself. He remembered that, too. Sira's first wife didn't help with the housework. She sat in the yard, every day, on the same rock, staring at the wall. Her hands lay on her knees, and her fingers sometimes twitched. Rain recognized that movement. She was grasping a hilt that wasn't there. Her body remembered the sword. Her hands remembered. Her muscles remembered. But the sword wasn't there. On the 5th day, Rain approached her. He sat down next to her on the ground, not on the rock, lower, so as not to be taller. He asked one thing. How long was her first training sword? Sira turned her head. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were gray and cold as a winter sky. She answered, 2¼ cubits, straight, light guard, horsehide grip. She spoke flatly and dryly as if describing someone else's thing, but her fingers clenched on her knees so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Rain nodded. He stood up. He left. He didn't promise her a sword. He didn't say he'd order one. He didn't say anything. Promises from a stranger are worse than silence. Promises create expectations. Expectations create vulnerability. And this woman had been made vulnerable by promises for far too long. On the 6th day, Rain went to see Braun. The dwarf was in his shop. He opened the door immediately. His debt to the guild was paid off. His license had been renewed. Braun looked different. His back was straighter. His beard was combed. His eyes were clear. He offered Rain some tea. Rain sat down and asked if Braun knew the old blind blacksmith. Braun knew him. Torvald. He lived outside the city, one of the best armorers in the province in the past, now blind. He worked by memory and touch. He took on few jobs. He charged a high price, but what he made had no equal in Calderon. Rain asked how much. Braun said it depended on the order. A simple sword, 5 silver. A complex one, up to 20. Rain nodded. He didn't have 20 silver. He didn't even have 5. But he had Braun, and Braun had more than one ring. There were other stones in the display case that the dwarf had mispriced because he was a master cutter, not an appraiser, and Rain was a master appraiser. They made a deal. Rain would come by every other day to appraise the merchandise, to point out the hidden value, to find buyers through his growing network. Braun gives Rain a percentage of the profit. Not a fixed rate, a percentage. Because Rain knew that his appraisals would bring in more and more, and a fixed rate would stifle growth. Braun agreed. He didn't fully understand this strange, rankless boy, but he understood one thing. This boy saw what no one else saw, and that was worth a cup of tea and some trust. By the end of the 2nd week, Rain had 7 silver pieces saved up, 3 from selling stones through Braun, 2 from brokerage services, 1 from finding a grain wholesaler for the innkeeper in the square that the innkeeper didn't know about, and the innkeeper saved a silver coin a month and gave the first silver to Rain for the tip. Another from the offsetting of yet another triangular debt. The city of Calderon was crammed with hidden financial nodes. No one saw them because no one was looking. The people of this world did not think in terms of flows and balances. They thought in terms of rank and power, and that was their blind spot. And the market's blind spots had been Rain Ashford's bread and butter his entire life. At the end of the 2nd week, something happened. Rain returned home in the evening. Sira was sitting on a rock in the courtyard. Una was by the hearth. Leanne was standing by the window on the 2nd floor. Everything was as usual. But there was a plate on the table. On the plate lay a piece of bread and a slice of cheese. Rain stopped. He looked at the plate. He hadn't saved any food for himself that morning. He always laid everything out on the table for them and left hungry. He thought they didn't notice. They had noticed. One of them had left him a portion. Rain didn't know who. He didn't ask. He sat down. He ate. The bread was from yesterday, but the butter was fresh. Someone had found the butter Rain had bought the day before yesterday in the cellar and spread it on the bread. A small gesture, tiny, insignificant to any outside observer, but Rain knew the value of such gestures. In Manhattan, when the company you'd invested in showed a positive cash flow for the first time, even if it was just a penny, it meant one thing: a turnaround. The model works. The bottom has been passed. Growth is inevitable. The only question is speed. That night, the system activated again. Heat, pain in the joints, nosebleed, words in the dark. Connection 3 out of 1,000. Progress recorded. New parameter, mana perception +2. Appraisal skill updated. New function. Hidden potential now displays the cause of the block with details. Rain wiped the blood away. He read the update and realized he had just received a tool worth more than all of Calderon's silver. If before he could see that a seal had been placed by the house or the temple, now he could see exactly how it worked, what mechanism, what key, and how much that key cost. He looked at the sleeping women. The assessment had updated and now showed more. Sierra Winterhold, blood seal, type, mana flow inversion, blocking mechanism, runic glyph on the right wrist, visible, disguised as an old scar. Key to removing the first layer, weapon crafted to the exact specifications of the wearer's body. The sword must resonate with the inverted flow rather than suppress it. Cost of the key, 5 to 15 silver. Rain read this and closed his eyes. 15 silver. He had 7. In 2 weeks, he'll have 15. The math is simple. The time is set. The position on Seer is preparing to open. 3 weeks after the purchase. Rain sat at the table and counted. The silver lay in piles. 15 coins, exactly what was needed for the upper limit of an order from the blind blacksmith Torvald. But ordering a sword wasn't just a matter of coming in and paying. Torvald didn't work by standard measures. He worked by the body. He needed to touch the hand of the person for whom he was forging, every finger, every joint, every callus. This meant that Sierra had to be brought to him, and Sierra hadn't spoken more than 10 sentences in 3 weeks. Not by force, by choice. She conserved her words like a soldier conserves arrows. Every morning she went out into the courtyard, sat down on a stone, did something with her hands. Rain watched from the window and one day realized what she was doing. She was training, without a weapon, without movement, inside. Her fingers clenched and unclenched in a specific rhythm. Right hand, grip, turn, hold, release, grip again. She went through a swordsman's drills in her head, repeating the grips with her hands on her knees. A body without a sword, trained to hold a sword that wasn't there. Rain saw this, and every time something tugged at him inside. Not pity. Rain didn't know how to feel pity. He knew how to assess, and what he saw wasn't pitiful. It was the kind of stubbornness that could move mountains. This woman had been cut off from her bloodline. Her skill had been broken. She had been sold off like trash, and every morning she went out onto the rock and trained her grip on an invisible sword. Because the body remembers, and because she won't allow herself to forget. On the 22nd day, Rain approached Sierra in the morning. He sat down on the ground next to the stone, below her, just like last time. He said he needed her help. Sierra looked at him. He said there was a blacksmith outside the city, an old man, blind, the best in the province. He could make something, but he needed to touch the hand of the person for whom he was making it. Rain said he wouldn't explain why, that Sierra would see for herself, but he needed her to go with him. Sierra was silent. 10 seconds, 20. Then she stood up. That meant yes. They walked out of town for 2 hours, in silence. Sarah walked 3 steps behind, not beside him. Rain didn't turn around, didn't rush her, didn't try to start a conversation. The road led through fields, then through a forest, then along a stream. Torvald's smithy stood in a clearing by a cliff, a low stone building, a chimney, smoke, the smell of hot metal and coal. Torvald sat at the anvil, huge, arms like tree trunks, eyes white, blind. But when they approached, he turned his head directly toward them. He had heard footsteps, 2 people, one light step, one heavy. He asked who it was. Rain gave his name, said he'd come to order a sword. Torvald asked for whom. Rain said for her, and nodded toward Sarah, though he knew the blacksmith wouldn't see the nod. Torvald stood up, walked over to Sarah, held out his hands, palms up. He waited. That was his method. The customer had to place their hands in his palms themselves, voluntarily. Sarah stood motionless. Rain saw her shoulders stiffen. Strange hands, a man's hands, reaching out to her. Everything in her body screamed no. But she looked at those palms, huge, calloused, with burns from metal. These were the hands of a blacksmith, not a soldier, not an overseer, not those who broke, those who made. Sira placed her hands in his palms. Torvald worked in silence. His fingers slid over her wrists, every joint, every phalanx. A callus at the base of the thumb on his right hand, an old callus, from a sword. The pinky on his right, slightly crooked, a fracture, healed unevenly, long ago. His left hand, the index finger longer than the middle finger, a rarity, meaning her grip is shifted half an inch lower than standard. Torvald examined her hands for 5 minutes. Then he let go, sat back down, said one sentence. She'd been taught to hold someone else's sword. She needed her own. Rain nodded, asked how much. Torvald said 12 silver, 20 days. Because a special metal is needed, not steel, something softer, something that will bend with her grip, not against it. Rain placed 12 silver on the anvil. Torvald covered them with his palm. The deal was done. On the way back, Sira walked 2 steps behind, not 3, 2, a difference of 1 step. Rain noticed. They walked half the way in silence. Then Sira spoke. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask how. She asked how he knew about her pinky. Rain replied that he'd seen how she held the cup. Her pinky didn't rest on the handle like everyone else's. It veered slightly to the side. An old fracture, healed at an angle. Any standard sword would put pressure on that spot, and after an hour of fighting, her arm would give out. She needed a hilt with a recess in that spot. Then her pinky would rest naturally, and her grip would be stronger than that of any swordsman with healthy hands. Because she'd been compensating for that fracture for 20 years, and the muscles around it had become twice as strong as normal. Sira stopped. Rain took 2 more steps before he realized she was standing still. He turned around. Sira was looking at him. Her face was impassive. Her lips were pressed together. But her eyes. There was something in her eyes that Rain had seen only once in his life, in a past life. When the CEO of the company he'd saved from bankruptcy called him at 3 a.m. and stayed silent on the line for 30 seconds before saying a single word. Thank you. Sira didn't say thank you. She just stood there and looked. Then she walked on, this time beside him, not behind him, beside him. At home, Rain turned his attention to Yuna, not directly, indirectly, through objects. He noticed that every evening Yuna sat by the hearth and stared at the fire, not just staring, whispering, her lips moving, silently. He could have gone over and asked, but he didn't. Instead, he began to search. The assessment showed a seal placed on Yuna by the Temple of the Morning Dawn. The type of block? Suppression of the spiritual voice. The mechanism? Ritual substitution. Her own voice had been replaced by a stranger's, the voice of the goddess. When the goddess fell silent, Yuna was declared empty. But she wasn't empty. The voice was there, her own, beneath layers of someone else's suppression. The key to the first layer of the seal, a prayer spoken in her own voice, not memorized, not temple style, her own. Rain couldn't force Yuna to say her prayer. It didn't work that way. But he could create conditions under which she would want to do it herself. In the evening, he brewed tea. Not the usual kind. He remembered that a week ago, Yuna had let slip a single phrase. She was sitting by the hearth, and Leanne brought water, and Yuna took a cup and sniffed it. And for a second her face changed. Soft, distant. And she whispered 2 words. Like home. Rain remembered. He remembered everything. Exactly what kind of tea it was that day, what herbs he had bought, what could produce that scent. He began experimenting. He bought dried herbs at the market, mint, thyme, chamomile, wild lavender, jasmine, anise seeds. Every evening he brewed a new blend. He set it before Yuna. He watched her face. The first evening, Una sniffed. She shook her head. No, not that one. The second evening, she sniffed, took a sip, set it down. Close, but no. The third evening, mint and jasmine with a drop of honey. Una lifted the cup, inhaled. Her hands trembled. She took a sip, set the cup down, looked at Rain. It's bitter. Rain nodded. The fourth evening, less mint, more jasmine, honey replaced with maple syrup. Una lifted the cup with both hands, inhaled, took a sip. Her eyes closed. She held the cup and didn't move for 10 seconds. Then she opened her eyes. They were wet. She said quietly, Almost. Rain nodded. The fifth evening, he added a pinch of dried rosehip, a random thought, intuition, or maybe the assessment had prompted him through some channel he wasn't aware of. Una took the cup. She inhaled, took a sip, and began to cry. Silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she held the cup with both hands, unable to stop. It was that very tea, the one she used to drink at home, as a child, before the temple, before the goddess's voice, before the purification, before everything. Rain sat across from her and said nothing. He didn't comfort her. He didn't say that everything would be all right. He didn't touch her. He just sat there and waited, because the tears were hers, not his. And to comfort her would mean taking away her right to cry as much as she needed to. Una cried for 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve. She finished her tea. She set down the empty cup. She looked at Rain and quietly asked, Could she have some more? Rain silently poured a second cup. Tonight, the system. Connection 7 out of 1,000. Progress accelerated. Clarification. Connection with Subject 2 advanced by 4 units in a single event. Targeting confirmed. Rain lay by the door and stared into the darkness. Targeting confirmed. The system didn't read gifts. It read intent. Not the tea. The fact that the tea was for Una, specifically for her, according to her memory, according to her taste, according to her tears. Rain understood the mechanics, and that changed everything. 20 days passed faster than Rain expected. The money flowed steadily. Braun brought in 2 silver pieces a week, the middleman another 1.5. Rain had built a small but stable network in the city of 7 people who owed him not money, but favors. A baker, a miller, a leather worker, an innkeeper, an old herbalist from the Eastern Market, a cart driver from the Southern Gate, and a clerk from the municipal office who, in exchange for help with his aunt's inheritance, now informed Rain of every interesting document that passed through his hands. Rain wasn't building an army. He was building an information network. Eyes and ears in every neighborhood. Each operative knew only their own part. No one knew the whole picture, except for Rain. Over those 20 days, the house had changed. Not all at once, gradually. Una took over the kitchen, not because Rain asked her to. It was because for 3 weeks he'd been making porridge so disgustingly that one morning Una silently pushed him away from the pot and made it herself. The porridge turned out different, with spices Una found in the overgrown garden behind the house, wild thyme and something else, something that Rain didn't know. From then on, Una did the cooking. Rain gave her money for groceries and didn't interfere. Sierra began clearing the yard. Every morning she went out and worked, pulling weeds, hauling rocks, leveling the ground. Rain figured out why on the 3rd day. She was clearing a training area, a place for a sword that didn't exist yet, but which she was preparing in advance. Leanne had changed too, not in her actions, in her presence. Before, she would stand by the window or sit in a corner and stare at the wall. Now she walked around the house, quietly, slowly. She touched the walls, she touched the furniture. Sometimes she stopped in the middle of the room and stood with her eyes closed. Rain watched and took notes. Every evening, after everyone had fallen asleep, he took out his notebook, a thin one with a leather cover. He'd bought it from a bookseller for a penny, and he wrote, 1 line a day, about Liam. Today, she touched the windowsill with her left hand. She stood there for 12 seconds. Today, she smelled the jasmine in the garden and tilted her head slightly to the right. Today, she looked at the rain, and her left eye grew lighter. Rain didn't know why he was doing this. The assessment didn't suggest a mechanism for removing the seal for Leanne. Because Leanne had question marks instead of parameters, the system didn't know what to do with her. Rain didn't know either. But he knew one thing from his past life. When you don't understand an asset, collect data, every day, without fail. Sooner or later, the data will speak for itself. On the 21st day, Rain went to see Torvald, alone, in the morning, along the wet road through the forest. The smithy was smoking. Torvald sat at the anvil. A sword lay before him. Rain saw it and stopped in the doorway. He wasn't a weaponsmith. He didn't know anything about forging. He couldn't tell a good balance from a bad one just by looking. But the assessment could. It turned on by itself. Numbers floated above the sword. Work quality, S. Compatibility with the bearer, estimated, SSS. Runic resonance, inactive. Activation upon first contact with the target bearer. Hidden potential, catalyst for removing the first layer of the seal. Torvald held out the sword. Rain took it. Heavy, not for his hands, for other hands. For those with a slightly crooked pinky, a callus at the base of the thumb, and a grip half an inch below standard. He thanked the blacksmith. Torvald nodded. Then he said one thing. He said that woman's hands remember more than they're supposed to. He said that hands are like metal. They can be broken, but they cannot be made to forget their form. And that this sword would not make her stronger. It would simply tell her hands that they were right. Rain returned home around noon. Sira was sitting in the courtyard on a cleared patch of ground. Everything around her was clean. The stones had been cleared away. The ground was level. She sat there, her hands going through their usual motions, grasp, twist, hold. Rain approached. He sat down beside her. He placed a long bundle wrapped in coarse cloth between them. He said nothing. Sira looked at the bundle, at Rain, at the bundle. She knew, by its shape, by its length, by its weight. She knew what it was. Her hands began to move before her mind gave the command. The cloth fell. The sword lay on the ground. The blade was slightly curved. The hilt was covered in dark leather. The guard was simple, without adornments. 2 1/4 cubits long, exactly as she had said 3 weeks ago. Sira took the sword in her right hand. Her little finger rested in the indentation on the hilt. Exactly, like a nest. Her thumb wrapped around the hilt where a callus met the skin, and they fit together like a lock and a key. She tightened her grip. The sword hummed, quietly, low, as if a string had been plucked in the air. Runic resonance activated. The display showed numbers. First layer of the seal, destabilization, start of the removal process. Estimated time, 2 to 4 weeks with regular contact with the catalyst. Sira stood with the sword in her hand. She didn't move. She just stood there. Her back was straight. Her shoulders were squared, feet shoulder-width apart. Her body remembered a posture it hadn't assumed with full force in 20 years. Then a tear rolled down her cheek. 1. Rain saw it. He turned away. Not because he felt awkward, because that tear was hers. Her moment, her sword, her body. He had simply provided the entry point. From there, she was on her own. He went inside. Una stood by the kitchen window and looked out into the yard. She saw everything. Rain walked past her to the table. He sat down. Una silently placed a cup of tea in front of him. That very one, with jasmine and rosehip. Rain looked at the cup, then at Una. Una wasn't looking at him. She was looking out into the courtyard where Sira had begun to move, slowly, carefully. The first swing in years. The blade sliced through the air, and the air hummed. Una watched it and smiled quietly, the first smile Rain had seen on her face. That evening, Sira entered the house, the sword in its sheath on her belt. She hadn't taken it off, not even at dinner, not even while she ate. Her left hand rested on the sheath, not gripping it. She was touching it, the way you touch something you're afraid of losing. She sat down at the table. She looked at Rain and said 3 words. "How did you know?" Rain replied that he'd seen how she held the cup. Sierra was silent for 5 seconds. Then she nodded. Rain realized that it was more than a nod. It was an admission. Minimal, restrained, but the first. That night, the system. Connection 14 of 1,000. A jump. Connection with Object 1 advanced by 9 units in a single event. Maximum targeting confirmed. System note. Catalyst activated for Object 1. Process of removing the first layer of the seal initiated. Estimated time, 3 weeks. Rain lay on the floor. His body was burning. His joints were twisting. Blood flowed from his nose more heavily than before. An F-rank body wasn't designed for such a flow. Every night, the Union injected a drop of foreign mana into him, and his body protested in every way it knew how. But the numbers were rising. Mana perception +5, physical stamina +1, reaction speed +1. Meager numbers. Compared to SSS, they were crumbs. But crumbs that added up. Rain endured. He was good at that. Enduring and waiting. 2 skills that no rank valued and that were worth more than any rank. On the morning of the 22nd day, Rain woke up to a sound. The clang of metal. He went out into the courtyard. Sierra was standing on the platform, practicing with her sword. The full routine. Not just fingers on her knees, her whole body. The blade. The movements were slow, cautious. Her body was remembering, and her body was making mistakes. But it was moving. For the first time in years, Sierra Winterhold was holding a sword that was hers. And every swing told her body one thing. You aren't broken. You were locked away, and the door opens. Rain stood on the porch and watched. He didn't judge, he didn't count, he just watched. Then he went back inside. He made tea, for Yuna, using that same recipe. He set it on the table. He took out his notebook. He wrote a line about Leanne. Today she slept, for the first time. Her eyes were closed. She was breathing evenly. Maybe because it rained at night and the drops were tapping on the wooden eaves. Rain closed the notebook, put it away, sat down at the table with a cup of hot water, looked out the window. Sierra on the playground. Yuna will come down soon. Leanne is sleeping. Home. Small, shabby, on the outskirts of a city that doesn't respect him, but a home. The first step, the foundation, and every day it grew a little stronger, by a millimeter, by a cup of tea, by a swing of the sword, by a line in the notebook. Rain drank water and thought about the next step. In a month, Sierra would finish removing the first layer of the seal. It wouldn't restore full power, but it would restore access to the mana flow. At least to part of it. In 2 months, they could start working on Yuna's seal. In 3. Rain stopped himself. Don't rush. That was the first law, in the market and in life. The biggest money is made by those willing to wait the longest. The future isn't what matters now. What matters now is that Yuna is coming down the stairs, sitting down at the table, picking up a cup, and drinking. And that her hands aren't shaking. What matters now is that metal is clanging in the courtyard, and that this sound doesn't frighten the residents of the house. This sound evokes something else, something that makes Yuna smile as she looks out the window, while Leanne sleeps so soundly for the first time that she doesn't wake up even from the clanging. It was called safety, a precious asset, a rare one, something you can't buy with silver, only build, brick by brick, every day. A month had passed since the day Sierra took up the sword. Every morning she went out to the training ground before dawn. Every evening she returned when the sun set. Between those 2 points, there was only the blade and her body. Rain watched through the assessment. The numbers were changing. Slowly, but they were changing. The first layer of the seal was 60% destabilized. The flow of mana in her right hand was partially restored. Striking power had tripled compared to the initial level. Reaction speed was approaching B rank. And that was only the first layer. Rain didn't know how many there were. The assessment didn't show the depth of the seal, only the current layer. But even a single layer was enough to grasp the scale of what was locked inside this woman. Sierra moved differently. Before, her body had been angular and tense. Her shoulders were raised, her neck was stiff. Now her shoulders had dropped, her neck was relaxed. Her movements had become longer, smoother. The blade didn't chop through the air, it flowed through it. Rain saw that the sword was changing not only her skill, it was changing her body. The muscles that had spent 20 years compensating for the broken flow began to rebuild themselves. The blood inversion that Dom Winterhold considered a defect turned out not to be a mistake. It was a special feature. Mana in Sierra's body flowed in reverse. In ordinary swordsmen, mana flowed from the heart to the hand and into the blade. In Sierra, mana flowed from the blade through the hand to the heart. A standard sword resisted this flow. It broke, or it broke the hand. But Torvald's sword was made differently. It accepted the reverse flow, and when the mana completed a full cycle from the blade to the heart and back, the force of the strike doubled. Because the energy wasn't expended on the output, it returned and combined with itself. Rain read this in the assessment figures and sat at the table in silence for a long time. House Winterhold didn't just break Sierra. They discarded a technique that, with the right weapon, surpassed any standard style. They looked at the inversion and saw a flaw. Rain looked and saw a competitive advantage that the entire market had overlooked. Classic. An absolute classic. On the 32nd day, the sword stopped humming. At first, Rain thought it was a bad sign, but the assessment showed the opposite. Resonance complete. First layer of the seal removed. Sword and bearer synchronized. Current combat potential rank: A. Potential upon full removal of the seal: SSS. Sierra stood on the platform holding the sword. The blade was silent. Her hands were silent. Her entire body was silent. But in that silence lay the thing that hadn't been there a month ago. Rain saw her make a single swing. Simple, vertical, from top to bottom. The air split. Not a metaphor. The air in front of the blade became visible for a moment, a strip of compressed space. And then a pop, as if someone had broken a window. Sierra looked at her hand, at the sword, at the line in the air that had already vanished. And Rain saw on her face something he hadn't seen once in all these weeks. She smiled, with one corner of her mouth, for half a second. But it was a smile. That evening at dinner, Sierra sat at the table differently. Before, she had sat at the edge, with her back to the wall, facing the door, ready to stand and strike at any moment. Now she sat with her back to the door, facing the table, toward Rain, toward Yuna, toward Leanne. She had turned her back to the exit, because now a sword stood between her and the door, and she trusted it, which meant she was a millimeter closer to trusting the one who had given her that sword. Rain noticed. He didn't show that he had noticed. He poured her some tea. Plain tea. Not the special kind he made for Yuna, just hot, strong tea, the kind soldiers drink. Sierra took the cup. She nodded. This was their language. Minimal, wordless, but precise. Yuna had been changing these past few weeks, too. After that evening with the tea, something had cracked in the wall she'd kept around herself for 5 years. It hadn't collapsed, it had cracked. A fissure, a thin one, through which something alive sometimes slipped. She began to speak, not much, short phrases, requests. Could she take flour from the pantry? Could she put flowers on the windowsill? Could she go out into the garden in the evening? Each request sounded as if years of training not to ask stood behind it. Rain answered the same way every time. This is your home. You don't need permission. By the 4th time, Yuna stopped asking. She just did it. And that was more than progress. It was recovery. Slow, painful, but real. Leanne remained an enigma. Rain's notebook grew, a new line every evening. Doesn't like it when more than 2 candles are lit in the room. Sometimes stands by the well and listens to the water. Spoke today in a language Rain didn't recognize, the 6th one in the last month. Her left eye changes color depending on the weather. Green on a clear day, blue when it rains, gray in the fog. The data piled up. No patterns emerged, but Rain wasn't in a hurry. One evening, he was sitting at the table, writing in his notebook. Leanne stood in the doorway. Rain hadn't noticed when she'd come in. She moved so quietly that not even the floorboards creaked beneath her. She was looking at the notebook. Rain looked up. Their eyes met. Leanne reached for the notebook. Rain handed it to her. She opened the first page, read it, turned the page, read it. She turned the page. She read for 5 minutes, every line, every observation. She doesn't like mint. She falls asleep to the sound of rain. She holds a spoon with her left hand. She sniffed the jasmine in the garden and tilted her head to the right. She slept with her eyes closed for the first time that night when it was raining. Leanne closed the notebook, pressed it to her chest, stood like that for 10 seconds. Then she put the notebook back on the table, looked at Rain, and said 4 words. "This is all about me." Rain nodded. Leanne stood there for another second. Then she turned and went to her room. That night, Rain woke up from the cold. Not the usual kind, a different kind. The air in the room had turned icy. His breath came out in steam. He sat up. Leanne was standing in the middle of the room. Her eyes were open, and both were glowing. The left one blue, the right one gold. A pattern was emerging on the floor around her. Thin lines, silver. They radiated from her feet like tree roots and disappeared into the walls. Yuna woke up and huddled in the corner of the bed. Sira jumped up with a sword in her hand. Rain raised his hand, his palm towards Sira. "Stop." He activated assessment. The numbers above Leanne were changing. Question marks flickered. Symbols appeared and vanished that Rain had never seen before. And then, for a second, just a single second, the question marks vanished and a number appeared in their place, so large that the assessment couldn't display it in its entirety. The first 3 digits, and then question marks again. Leanne blinked. The glow faded. The pattern on the floor melted away. The air warmed. She stood barefoot on the cold stone and looked at her hands as if she were seeing them for the first time. Then she looked at Rain. Her face was calm, but fear appeared in her eyes for the first time. Not of Rain, of herself. Rain stood up. He walked over to her, slowly. He took the blanket from the bed, draped it over her shoulders. He said 1 sentence. He said that they would talk in the morning, that she needed to lie down now, and that everything was fine. Leanne looked at him. She said she didn't know what that had been. Rain replied that he didn't know either, but that they would figure it out. Leanne lay down. Rain returned to the door. Sira stood there with her sword, looking at him. Her eyes asked a question. Rain shook his head. Not now. Sira put her sword away. She lay down, but Rain could see she hadn't fallen asleep until morning. He hadn't slept either. He sat by the door and thought. The 3 digits he'd seen for a single second. He'd memorized them, a professional habit. The numbers were etched into his memory like a photograph. The first 3 digits of Leanne's potential were greater than the combined full potential of Sira and Yuna, multiplied by 10. Rain sat in the darkness and, for the first time in his life, felt that his own rating might not be enough for what lay ahead. System. Connection 19 of 1000. Progress recorded. New parameter unlocked. Intuitive threat perception. Rain read the notification. Into perception of threat. Not mana, not power. Threats. The system gave him a sense of it, because next to what slept inside Leanne, that sense was not a luxury, but a necessity. The morning after the night's incident with Leanne began quietly, too quietly. Una didn't come out for breakfast. Rain found her in the corner by the hearth. She was sitting with her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth, barely noticeably. Rain sat down beside her. He didn't ask. He waited. 5 minutes later, Una spoke. She said the pattern on the floor looked familiar to her. She had seen one like it in the temple. When the goddess spoke through her, that same pattern would appear on the stone around the altar. Silver lines, like roots. Una said that after that, purification usually began. She spoke the word flatly, without inflection, the way one pronounces a word that has burned everything inside and become an empty sound. Ryan sat and listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort her. Una said she was afraid, not of Leanne, of herself. Because when she saw that pattern, her first thought was to run, and her second thought was that there was nowhere to run, and that second thought made her feel worse than the first. Rain asked one thing. He asked if she wanted tea. Una looked at him. Her eyes were red. She said yes. Rain stood up. He made tea, that very tea. He set it in front of her. Una took the cup with both hands. She held it. She drank in small sips. 10 minutes later, her hands stopped shaking. Rain didn't say a single word of comfort. He didn't say that everything would be all right. He didn't say he would protect her. He gave her a cup and time, because he knew that words from a man had been a tool of control for Una for the past 5 years. Words were spoken by the priests when they led her to purification. Words were spoken when they bound her. Words were spoken when they explained why she was in pain. The tea said nothing. The tea was simply warm. Sierra went out into the courtyard as usual, but today she didn't train. She stood by the gate, with a sword at her belt, facing the street. She kept watch. After last night, something inside her had shifted. She saw the threat inside the house, and her body decided the perimeter needed to be secured. Rain saw this from the window and understood. Sierra had made a decision, not with words, with her body. She stood between the house and the world, like a soldier taking up a post. She didn't trust Rain yet, but she was already defending the place where she lived. And that was the beginning of something greater than trust. It was belonging. Leanne came down for dinner. Her face was calm. Her eyes were ordinary, the left one green, the right one brown. No glow. She sat down at the table and looked at her plate, then at Rain. Rain set the food in front of her, as usual, without asking questions. Leanne ate in silence. Then she looked up and said she didn't remember what had happened that night, that the last thing she remembered was closing her notebook and walking to bed. Rain nodded. He said nothing terrible had happened, that they would figure it out when they were ready. Leanne nodded. She looked at her hands. She placed her palms on the table. Her fingers were trembling slightly. She didn't remember, but her body did. Her body knew that something immense had passed through it that night. Rain dropped the subject. He didn't press her. He didn't ask questions. Instead, that evening, he wrote in his notebook. Doesn't remember the night's episode. Hands trembled for about an hour after lunch, then settled down. Left eyes slightly lighter than usual all day. Back to normal by evening. Data. Always data. Sooner or later it'll speak. The next day, Rain turned his attention to another matter. Money. Thorvald's sword had eaten up the budget. Silver reserves had dropped to 3 coins. A new source of income was needed. Not a one-off, a steady one. Rain sat down with Braun in his shop and laid out a plan before him, not on paper, in his head. But he spoke, and Braun listened. There were 12 jewelry shops in Calderon. Braun ranked last in sales. Not because his merchandise was inferior, because he didn't know how to sell. He knew how to make things, but selling is a different skill. Rain offered to become his sales agent, not an assistant, an agent. Rain would handle appraising the merchandise and finding buyers. Braun would handle purchasing and processing. The profit split would be 30% to Rain and 70% to Braun. Braun objected that 30% was too much for a middleman. Rain replied that he would double his turnover in the first month. If not, Braun could terminate the contract without penalty. Braun thought it over. He agreed. Because over the past 6 weeks, this strange, low-ranking boy hadn't been wrong once. Not in a single appraisal, not in a single forecast. Rain got to work. Every day he walked the market. The scanner scanned goods on store shelves throughout the city. Not just jewelry, everything. Fabrics, spices, weapons, books, herbs, artifacts. Rain was looking for the same thing he'd been looking for his entire past life. Undervalued assets. Things that were worth more than their owners thought. He found them every day. A fabric merchant had a piece of silk that he considered ordinary. The appraisal showed that the silk was imbued with a faint wind mana. Useless to an ordinary person, priceless to a house whose air is training in the element of wind. Rain bought the scrap for 3 copper coins and sold it through Braun for 2 silver coins. At a junk dealer's stall in the southern market lay a worn leather belt with faded runes. Rain saw through appraisal that the runes hadn't faded. They were in sleep mode. A reinforcement belt, B rank. It's dormant because it's discharged. Recharging costs 3 copper coins at any rune workshop. Rain bought the belt for a copper coin. He recharged it. He sold it for 4 silver coins to a guard from the southern garrison who had been dreaming of such a belt for 3 years but couldn't afford a new one for 10. By the end of the second week of their partnership, Braun's turnover had more than doubled, tripled. Not because Rain was selling at a higher price, because he was selling more precisely, to each buyer exactly what they needed, at a price that seemed like a bargain to the buyer, but was actually the market value that no one but Rain could calculate. Braun looked at the rising numbers and shook his head every evening. He didn't understand how, but he understood that this young man saw the world differently, as if everyone else's eyes were closed and his were open. By the end of the 6th week after purchasing the contracts, Rain had 22 silver coins in savings. The house was renovated. The roof didn't leak. The windows had shutters. The yard was clean. The pantry wasn't empty. The 3 women were dressed. They had shoes on. They are fed. Each of them slept in her own room on the 2nd floor. Rain still slept on the 1st floor by the door. He didn't move upstairs. He didn't hint. He didn't ask. The door between the 1st and 2nd floors didn't lock from his side. It locked from their side. And every evening Rain heard the latch. And every evening he smiled. Because a woman who locks the door is a woman who believes that a closed door will be respected. And that belief was worth more than any open entrance. In the 7th week, the first messenger arrived. Rain was returning from Braun when his intuitive sense of danger kicked in for the first time. A prick in the back of his neck, subtle like a needle. He stopped in the middle of the street and looked around. An ordinary evening, people heading home, merchants closing their stalls, nothing out of the ordinary. But the prick wouldn't go away. Rain turned assessment up to maximum. He scanned every person in his field of vision. 32 people. 31 ordinary, 1 not. A man by the wall across the street, gray raincoat, hood, standing too still. Assessment showed rank B, class Scout, hired. Employer, House Ashgrave. Assignment, surveillance of target Rain Ashgrave. Additional info, hidden debt, 4 silver, gambling. Family, 1 child, wife is sick. Treatment costs 6 silver, can't afford it. Rain read all this in 3 seconds. He turned and walked straight toward him. The man flinched. His hand twitched toward his belt. Rain stopped 3 steps away. He said he knew who had sent him. He said he knew about the 4 silver debt and the sick wife. He said the man had a choice. Go back to Baron Ashgrave with a report that his illegitimate son was living in a ruin with 3 discarded wives and scraping on pennies. Or sit down with Rain and talk about how to earn 6 silver in 1 evening. The man stood motionless for 10 seconds. Then he took his hand off his belt. His name was Cale, a former scout for the border garrison, discharged due to injury 3 years ago. Since then, he'd been scraping by on odd jobs. The Ashgrave house paid him 2 silver pieces for a week of surveillance. 2 silver pieces for a week. That was an insult even by Calderon standards. Rain led him to the tavern on the square, sat down across from him, ordered 2 dinners. Cale ate greedily, like a man who had been skimping on food so he could afford medicine for his wife. Rain waited, then he spoke. He said he needed eyes and ears in the city, not a spy, an informant. Cale would do the same thing he did for the Baron: watch, listen, remember. Only he would report to Rain. The pay was 5 silver a week, plus Rain knew a herbalist who treated Cale's wife's illness for 4 silver pieces instead of 6. Cale listened. His face shifted. Distrust, calculation, hope, distrust again. He asked why Rain needed this, a rankless bastard hiring a B-rank scout. Why? Rain answered simply, because Baron Ashgrave sent one. That means he'll send a second and a third, and sooner or later it won't be a scout but an assassin, and Rain prefers to know about it in advance. Cale stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Rain laid 5 silver coins on the table, a deposit for the first week. Cale took them. They shook hands. Rain returned home and told Sira. Not everything, just that House Ashgrave had sent an observer and that the situation was under control. Sira listened. Her hand rested on her sword. She asked one thing: when the non-observers would arrive. Rain said that according to his calculations, in 2 months, maybe 3. The Baron would first try to act quietly, through the courts, through the temple, through pressure on trading partners. Direct violence would be the last resort. Sira nodded. She stood up. She went out into the courtyard. A minute later, Rain heard the clang of metal. She was training. But the nature of her training had changed. Before, she had been honing her skills. Now she was preparing for battle. Rain sat and thought. House Ashgrave, Baron Heldrick Ashgrave, his father, the man who 24 years ago ordered the killing of Rain's mother, a servant who had been careless enough to bear a bastard son by the Baron. The child was spared only because an F rank was not considered a threat, a dead zero, an empty space. Now that empty space had married 3 women under the law of the 3 moons, and by that law, Rain automatically became the head of her own junior line of House Ashgrave. Technically, formally, but in the world of Valemore, formality was everything. The law was written, and the law worked. Rain Ashgrave, the junior line, a disgrace to the Baron, a crack in the house's reputation, a blot on the coat of arms that must be erased. But erasing a living person with 3 contracts registered at the temple is not as simple as erasing the memory of a servant. Rain knew the Baron would apply pressure. The question wasn't whether he would. The question was how, when, and through whom. And he had to prepare for each scenario separately. The following week, Cale brought the first report. The Baron had approached the city magistrate with a request to review the legality of the marriage contracts. The grounds: Rain had failed to meet the property qualification for marriage under the law of the 3 moons. Rain read the report. He smiled. Property qualification. The law stated that a man entering into marriage under the law of the 3 moons must own real estate within the kingdom. The minimum requirement was 1 property. The Baron believed that Rain had no real estate, because information about the purchase of the house had not yet reached the capital. Bureaucracy moved slowly. Rain took the deed to the house out of his pocket, neatly folded, with the magistrate's seal, dated 18 days before the Baron's inquiry. He had bought the house before he needed it, out of habit, because cheap real estate is the first thing an investor buys, not because he needs it, because it will be needed, and because you shouldn't wait for prices to hit rock bottom. Rain passed a copy of the deed to the municipal office via the scribe, the very same scribe he had helped with his inheritance. The copy was sent to the capital by the next available courier. The Baron's request was dead on arrival. Cale brought a second report 3 days later. The Baron had appealed to the temple. The charge: Rain Ashgrave is suspected of illegally wielding the Lunar Union. The grounds: An unranked F class cannot be a bearer of the Lunar Union. This is a privilege of ranks A and above. Ryan read it and didn't smile. This was more serious. Temple inquisitors had the right to enter a home without warning, the right to interrogate, the right to search, the right to seize contracts. Ryan spent the evening in the temple library, the open section, accessible to all. He reread the Law of the Lunar Union, an old text, ancient, written in a language long since fallen out of use. But Rain had read contracts in 4 languages in his past life, and legal archaism was his native habitat. He found what he was looking for on page 17, the clause regarding the bearer. The law stated, "The Lunar Union is activated for the one chosen by the moon. The rank of the bearer is not specified." The privilege of rank A and above was not in the original law. It was in the amendment. An amendment adopted 200 years ago at the initiative of the temple's head at the time. The amendment did not repeal the original, it supplemented it. And according to Valemor's legal hierarchy, the original law stood above the amendment, always. It was a loophole the size of a fortress gate. And in 200 years, no one had looked into it. Because in 200 years, no one had needed to. No one except a rank-and-file bastard with 38 years of experience reading legal documents. Rain made a copy of the page, had it certified by the temple librarian, put it in his pocket, and went home. Calmly, without haste. The Baron could play this game for as long as he wanted. Rain knew every line of the law. The Baron did not. And therein lay the difference between someone who reads and someone who is used to having others read for him. The 3rd month, the house stood, the house lived. Mornings began the same way. Rain built the fire, Una cooked, Sira trained. Leanne walked around the house and touched the walls. Every day the same, every day a little different. Una began leaving flowers on the table, not every day, but often, wildflowers from the garden, small and plain. But she chose them according to some principle of her own and arranged them in a clay mug so that they looked right. Not beautiful, right. As if they were always meant to be right there. Rain began to notice something else. Una was whispering, not just by the hearth, everywhere. When she stirred the porridge, when she swept the floor, when she watered the flowers. Her lips moved and a whisper came from them. Rain wasn't eavesdropping, but the assessment heard. And one day it showed a line Rain hadn't expected. Spiritual channel, activity elevated, reason. Her own vocal practice, not temple-based, individual. Una was praying, not with the temple's prayers, in her own words, quietly, to herself. And every time she did this, the seal on her spiritual channel vibrated. It didn't crack, but it vibrated, like a wall being tapped on, from the inside. Rain realized it wasn't his place to remove that seal. Una was removing it herself, with every whisper, with every prayer of her own. All she needed was time and a place where no one would tell her to be quiet. Rain gave her both. At the end of the 3rd month, Cale brought news of a different kind. A squad had arrived in the city, 4 men, mercenaries, rank C to B. They'd stopped at a tavern on the southern outskirts, paid for 3 nights. Cale didn't know who'd hired them, but their route through the city matched Rain's. They were studying his schedule. Rain listened, nodded, went home, sat down at the table. He laid out the information. 4 mercenaries, B rank at most. Against Sira, an A rank with her first layer removed, this isn't a fight, it's a cleanup. But Rain didn't want a fight. A fight attracts attention. Attention attracts questions. Questions attract people who ask questions with a sword in their hand. He had to solve the problem quietly. He left the house in the evening, alone. He went to the tavern on the southern outskirts, sat down at a table in the corner, ordered water, waited. 4 mercenaries were sitting 3 tables away, drinking, loudly, carefree. They didn't expect their target to come to them. Rain activated assessment. He scanned each one. First, rank B, specialization, close combat. Debt, 7 silver. Creditor, a loan shark from Voltron, 2 months overdue. Second, rank C+, specialization, marksman. Injury to the left shoulder, chronic, constant pain. Third, rank C, specialization, reconnaissance. Family in the capital, wife and 2 children. Haven't seen them in 6 months. Fourth, rank B-, specialization, hand-to-hand combat. Addicted to an alchemical stimulant, withdrawal in 6 hours without a dose. Rain read all this in a minute. He stood up. He walked over to their table. The 4 of them looked up. Rain said he knew why they were here. He knew who had sent them, and he knew they'd been paid 15 silver for the 4 of them. 15 silver to kill a man with 3 wives. The mercenaries exchanged glances. Rain continued. He said that the first of them owed 7 silver to a loan shark in Voltron, and that in a month the loan shark would send men after him who were more dangerous than these 4. He said that the second man's shoulder wouldn't heal without treatment using blood alchemy, which cost 10 silver. He said that the third man's wife was due to give birth in the capital in 3 months, and he wouldn't see the child if he stayed in Calde for another week. He said that without a dose of the stimulant, the 4th man would collapse on the floor in 6 hours and scream so loudly that the whole neighborhood would hear him. The 4 sat in silence. Rain placed 20 silver coins on the table. It was all he had, except for some change for food. 20 silver, more than the client paid. Rain laid out the terms. They take the money, they return to the client and say the target has been warned and that an A-rank swordswoman is in the house. They aren't lying, they're just telling the truth. Then they leave Calderon. The first goes to Voltron to settle his debt. The third goes to his wife. The 4th, if he wants, can go to the herbalist in the Eastern Market who treats stimulant addiction. Her name is Tilda. Rain knows her personally. The treatment costs 2 silver. The mercenaries looked at the money, at Rain, at each other. The first one spoke up. He asked how a rankless knew so much. Rain replied that it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was right, and that 20 silver were lying on the table, waiting. Silence. 10 seconds. The first one took the money, divided it, 5 each, nodded to Rain. They stood up and left. In the morning, Kale reported. The 4 left the city at dawn, heading south. Rain exhaled. 20 silver, 2 months' work, gone in 1 evening. The balance is 0. Time to start over. But 4 people are alive, and his wives are alive, and no one fought with anyone. A clean deal. Rain sat down at the table at home and did the math. Braun would bring 2 silver at the end of the week. The commission was another 1.5. He could do another gem appraisal for Braun, plus 2. That made 5.5 for the week. In a month, 20 again. But the Baron won't wait a month. The Baron will find out the mercenaries are gone. He'll send others, or he'll come himself. A different approach was needed. Not defense, not reaction. Initiative. Rain thought for 3 days. On the 4th day, he went to the town clerk at the town hall. He asked for one thing. A list of all debt obligations registered in Calderon over the past 5 years, in which the name Ashgrave appears. The clerk turned pale. This was confidential information. Rain placed a piece of silver before him. 1, his last. The clerk looked at the silver, at Rain, at the silver. He took it. 3 days later, Rain held the list in his hands. 23 debt obligations. The Ashgrave house owed money to 23 people and organizations in Calderon and the surrounding area. The total amount of debt amounted to 480 silver. Rain looked at these figures, and an old, familiar ring sounded in his head. That very one. The Baron believed that power lay in rank and swords. Rain knew that power lay in balance. Whoever controls the debt controls the debtor. He didn't need 480 silver. He needed to buy up the key debts, those on which the Ashgrave estate's supplies depended: grain, firewood, stable maintenance. small but necessary. 20 silver in the right hands could put the Baron in the position from which he was accustomed to putting others. Rain put the list in his pocket. For the first time in 3 months, his face showed something resembling anticipation. Not anger, not revenge. Professional interest. Hunting for distressed assets was what he lived for, in his past life and in this one. By the 4th month, Rain had restored his finances and begun buying up debts. Not all of them, selectively. The first debt he bought was the smallest, 3 silver. The Ashgrave estate. Ashgrave owed an old farmer for a shipment of oats for the stables. The farmer had been waiting for payment for 4 months. Rain went to him and offered 2 silver coins for the right to collect. The farmer would get the money now. Rain would get a receipt. The farmer agreed without a second thought. 2 silver coins in hand were better than 3 promised by the Baron. The second debt, 5 silver coins. A carpenter who had repaired the roof of the east wing of the Ashgrave estate. He had done the work. He hadn't received any money. He had waited 6 months. Rain bought his promissory note for 4. Third, 8 silver coins. A laundress who served the estate. Fourth, 2 silver coins, a stable boy who hadn't been paid for 3 months. In 3 weeks, Rain bought up 11 small debts of the Ashgrave house. The total amount was 34 silver. He paid 26. The difference was his margin. But it wasn't about the margin. Each of these debts was a thread. On its own, a thread can be snapped. 11 threads together are already a rope. Rain didn't present the debts. He didn't demand payment. He simply stacked the receipts and put them away. He waited. While something else was happening at the same time. Una. One morning, she stopped whispering. At first, Rain didn't notice. Then he noticed the silence. Una stood by the hearth and was silent. Her lips didn't move, but the air around her was different. Warm, dense, as if the hearth itself were breathing back at her. Rain activated Assessment. Seal on the spiritual channel. First layer. Critical instability. Removal inevitable within 24 hours. He looked at Una. She stood motionless, eyes closed, hands folded across her chest. Not in prayer, in her own way, her left palm covering her right fist, as if holding something small and fragile. Then she spoke. Not a whisper. A voice. Quiet but clear. She spoke words that Rain didn't know, not in the common tongue, in another, the one that belonged to her. A prayer she had composed in childhood, for which she had been beaten, for which she had been punished. That very one. She spoke it not out of fear or pain, out of choice. The air in the room grew hot. The fire in the hearth flared up, not destructively, gently, as if someone had blown on the coals with tenderness. The warmth spread through the house, along the walls, across the floor, up to the ceiling. The stone of the walls became warm to the touch. Rain stood there and felt the warmth pass through the soles of his feet, up his body, and settle somewhere in his chest. System. Seal of Object 2. First layer removed. Spiritual channel partially restored. Mana type restored. Holy. Healing. Warmth. Protection of the hearth. Una opened her eyes. They were dry. She hadn't cried, not this time. She looked at her hands, unclenched them. Something lay in her right palm, small, glowing. Rain couldn't see what it was. The rating showed a question mark. 1. Una closed her palm. She raised her head. She looked at Rain. And for the first time in 4 months, she started a conversation on her own, without a question or a request. She said that when she was 10 years old and the goddess still spoke through her, she once heard not the goddess's voice, but her own. The voice spoke a single phrase. You are not empty. The priests said it was heresy, that the goddess's voice was the only permissible voice in the vessel. Una fell silent for 5 years, but the voice did not go away. It waited, all those years, in the temple, during the purification and the platform.
in this house. It waited for her to choose to speak it. Rain listened. He was silent. When Yuna finished, he did one thing. He poured her some tea. He set it down. Yuna looked at the cup, at Rain, and laughed. Quietly, briefly. The first laugh he'd heard from her. Because it was absurd and right at the same time. For 4 months, he responded to everything with the same thing. Tea. And it worked. From that day on, the house changed. Literally. The walls remained warm. Not hot. Warm. As if the house were embracing those who lived in it. Yuna didn't control it. It just was. Her holy-type mana permeated the stone and wood and brought the space to life. Sira was the first to notice. The next morning, she went out to train and stopped at the threshold. She looked at the wall. She placed her palm on it. She stood there. Then she looked at Yuna, who peeked out from the kitchen. Sira nodded at her. One short nod. Yuna nodded back. Rain stood by the window and saw this exchange. 2 nods. Between 2 women who had lived in the same house for 3 months and barely spoken. 2 nods that meant more than words. You made the house warm. Thank you. A connection between objects. Rain hadn't seen numbers like that in the system, but he saw them with his eyes. Leanne reacted too. That evening, when the walls grew warm, she went down to the common room for the first time and sat at the table, not because it was mealtime. She just came and sat down. She placed her hands on the table. She closed her eyes. She sat like that for 20 minutes. Rain sat across from her and wrote in his notebook. Yuna was washing dishes. Sira was cleaning her sword by the door. 4 people in one room. Everyone was busy with their own thing. No one spoke, but they were all together. Rain wrote in his notebook. Leanne had come into the common room of her own accord for the first time. She sat for 20 minutes, hands on the table, eyes closed, body relaxed. Maybe because of the warmth of the walls, maybe because of something else. He closed the notebook and thought about how, 4 months later, this house had ceased to be a shelter. It had become a home, not a building, a place where people chose to be. And that changed everything, because people who choose to be together are stronger than people who are forced to be, by any measure. The next day, Rain began the second phase of his work on the Ashgrove debts. Not buying them up, resale. He took the 3 smallest debts, a total of 4 silver coins, and sold them. Not to creditors, not to bankers. He sold them to the Ashgrave estate manager, the very same manager who was accountable to the Baron for operating expenses. The manager bought the debts at face value, 4 silver coins for 4 silver coins. No discount. Because Rain didn't come with an offer, he came with information. He told the steward that he knew of 8 other debts the Baron hadn't settled, and that if those debts fell into the wrong hands, the creditors wouldn't go to the steward, they would go straight to the Baron, and the Baron would ask the steward why he had allowed small debts to grow into a problem. The manager turned pale. He bought 3 debts. He asked to sell the rest. Rain said he'd think about it. He left. He thought about it. He didn't sell them. Because the 8 remaining debts weren't worth silver. They were worth leverage, pressure that could be increased or eased, like a portfolio of short positions. You don't have to close them out right now. You hold on to them as long as they work for you. Rain returned home. Sira was standing at the gates, on guard. She did this every evening now, without asking, without being told. Rain nodded to her as he passed. She nodded back. The house smelled of food and warmth. Yuna was cooking something new, with spices Rain didn't recognize. Leanne sat at the table with a notebook, his notebook. She sometimes took it and reread it. Rain didn't mind. It was her book, a book about her, the only one that existed in this world. Rain sat down. Evening, silence, the warmth of the walls, the smell of food. The sound was right, steady. Peaceful. He looked at the 3 silhouettes in the room, the swordswoman by the door, the priestess by the hearth, the enigma at the table. 4 months ago, he had bought them for 9 copper coins on a platform in the rain. Now they were worth more than the entire House Ashgrave, and the Baron didn't know it yet. But he would. Soon. Rain bought up 11 small debts of the House of Ashgrave for 26 silver and began using them as leverage. Una removed the first layer of the seal on her own by reciting her own childish prayer. Her holy manna filled the house with warmth. For the first time, Leanne voluntarily came to the common room and spent the evening with the others. The three women began to form a bond between themselves. The 5th month. Rain stood in the courtyard watching Sarah train, but today was different. Sarah wasn't alone. Una stood at the edge of the training ground. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her lips moved. A quiet whisper. A prayer. The air around Sarah grew denser, heavier. Every swing of the blade left a trail behind it, invisible to the eye, visible to the assessment. Lines of manna, thin, silvery. Sarah slashed, and manna flowed down the blade back into her body, returning and gathering. And Una stood and whispered, and her holy-type manna enveloped the area in a thin shield. They trained together. No one asked, no one offered. They found this rhythm on their own. Sarah attacked, Una held the perimeter. Two women who hadn't looked at each other 4 months ago were now working as a pair, without words, without discussion, as if their bodies knew something their minds did not. Rain activated assessment. Synergy of objects 1 and 2, combat effectiveness when acting together increased by 40%. The holy-type shield compensates for the swordsman's vulnerability during flow inversion. The swordsman's offensive power compensates for the priestess's lack of offensive capabilities. Rain read the numbers and thought, portfolio. Each covers the risk of the other. That's exactly what he told himself on the first day. 3 purchases aren't just 3 purchases. It's a structured position. And the position was starting to work. Leanne wasn't training. Leanne was watching. She stood by the second-floor window and looked down at the playground. Every day, from the first day of their joint training. Rain noticed that after every training session, Leanne's left eye was lighter than usual. Something inside her was reacting, but it didn't come to the surface. Rain took notes and waited. In the 6th month, what Rain had both hoped for and feared at the same time happened. Baron Heldrick Ashgrave arrived in Calderon in person. Cale gave 2 days' notice, a carriage bearing the coat of arms, 6 escort riders, 2 servants, 1 advisor. The Baron hadn't visited Calderon in 3 years. The last time was when he settled a trade dispute with the Blacksmiths Guild. Now he had come because of a son he hadn't acknowledged for 24 years. Rain was preparing, not for battle, for a meeting. He knew the Baron wouldn't come to his home. The Baron would summon him, through the magistrate, through the temple, through any official channel that would allow him to stand above. Rain had no intention of answering the summons. He intended to come on his own terms. On the morning of the 3rd day after the Baron's arrival, Rain got dressed, not in a tattered cloak. Over the past 5 months, he had acquired decent clothes, simple, clean, dark, without coats of arms or adornments. The clothes of a man who isn't trying to appear to be someone, who simply is. He went to the inn where the Baron was staying, the best in town, a stone building on the main square, 2 guards at the entrance, both rank B. Rain approached. He said he wanted to see Baron Ashgrave. The guards exchanged glances. One asked who he was. Rain replied, Rain Ashgrave, junior line. The guard blinked. He went inside. 10 minutes later, he returned. He led Rain into a room on the 2nd floor. The Baron was sitting at a table. Rain saw him for the first time in this life. The former Rain had seen the Baron once, when he was 10. Just a glimpse, through the orphanage fence as the Baron rode past on horseback. But that 10-year-old boy's gaze had been clouded and frightened. This gaze was different. Rain looked at the Baron and saw numbers. Haldrick Ashgrave, age 56, rank A, warrior strategist type, health deteriorating, liver, joints, early stage of manic exhaustion, Estimated active lifespan, 3 to 5 years. Financial status, critical, concealed. External debt, 480 silver. Internal debt, hidden. More. Significantly more. Ryan read this in 5 seconds and realized what he had suspected for 2 months. The House of Ashgrave was bankrupt. Not formally. Formally, everything looked decent, but in reality, the house was empty. The Baron was squandering the last of his resources, bluffing. He was keeping up appearances on his last reserves. And he had come to Calderon not because his bastard son was a threat to his pride. He had come because his bastard son had started buying up his debts. And the Baron realized that someone could see what he was hiding. The Baron looked at Rain, silently, his face stony. His eyes were cold, gray, just like Ryan's. One face for 2 men, divided by 24 years and a wall of silence. The Baron spoke first. He said he knew about the younger line. He knows about the 3 contracts. He knows about the debts that Rain bought up. And he offers a deal. Rain hands over the receipts, cancels the contracts, receives 200 silver and the right to leave Calderon. A generous offer, in the Baron's opinion. Rain sat down across from him without being invited. The Baron didn't react. He just narrowed his eyes slightly. Rain said he wouldn't sell. The Baron asked what he wanted. Rain said he wanted one thing. A name. His mother's name, spoken aloud, in front of witnesses. The Baron was silent. His expression didn't change. But Rain saw through the assessment how the stress indicator spiked, from moderate to high in 2 seconds. The Baron said it was impossible. Rain nodded. He stood up, said that in that case the conversation was over, and that he would continue buying up debts, and that in 6 months the entire credit history of the House of Ashgrave would be sitting in his desk drawer. He walked out, calmly, without haste, closed the door, went down the stairs, stepped out onto the street, and only there did he let his hands tremble. 2 seconds. Then he clenched his fists, unclenched them. He walked home. At home, Sira was standing by the gate. She looked at him. She saw something in his face. She didn't ask. She just nodded. Rain went inside. Yuna set tea before him. No questions. He sat down and drank and was silent and thought. The Baron wouldn't accept the terms right away. That was understandable. To utter the name of the maid he'd ordered killed meant admitting she'd existed, admitting the murder had taken place. Publicly, in front of witnesses. For a man who had spent 24 years building a reputation on the fact that this woman never existed, that would be death. Not physical, social. Rain knew what the Baron would think. He would look for another way out. He would send new people. Maybe not mercenaries. Maybe something worse. But Rain also knew that time was on his side. Every month the debt grows. Every month Rain's position strengthens. Every month the 3 women in his house grow stronger, and the Baron grows weaker. Manic exhaustion. 3 years, 5 at most. Rain could wait. The Baron could not. And that was the whole difference. The arbitration of time. The simplest and deadliest strategy. The 7th month. Cale reported that the Baron hadn't left. He'd stayed in the city, not at a hotel. He'd rented a house on the west side. Quietly, without fanfare. This meant the Baron had shifted from quick strikes to a siege. He intended to sit in Calderon and wait for a mistake, or create one. Rain took note. He adjusted his plans. He continued working. By this time, Braun had become the leading jeweler in the 3rd Commercial District, not by reputation, by turnover. Ryan found him 4 new gemstone suppliers. 3 of them were small-time miners, ignored by the major houses. The 4th was the widow of a miner who sat on a stockpile of rough stones and didn't know their value. Ryan knew. He always knew. Braun's turnover increased 5-fold in 7 months. Ryan's 30% cut brought in a steady 8 silver a week. P plus brokerage, plus consulting. Ryan had become the man people came to for advice,
Not nobles, merchants, artisans, small debtors. Those at the bottom. Those whom Ryan understood better than anyone because he saw right through them and because he'd been there himself. One day, a woman came to him. Not young, not old. Red hair, freckles, strong hands. Eyes tired, but not broken. The assessment above her read, Maeve Calloway, 26 years old, widow of a junior knight. Debt to creditors, 30 silver. Due date expired 2 weeks ago. Creditor's next move, debt pit. Management skill A. Loyalty to employer with fair treatment, SS. Suppressed potential scout warrior. Rain read it, and it took him 3 seconds to make a decision. Maeve didn't come to ask. She came to offer a job. Her own. She'd heard that a rank and file on the outskirts was looking for people and paid fairly. She said she knew how to run a household, that she'd managed her husband's home for 5 years while he was alive, that after his death she'd kept the estate afloat for another year on her own, that the creditors took the house but didn't take her skills. Rain listened. Then he asked one thing. He asked how much she owed. Maeve named the amount, 30 silver. Rain nodded. He said he would pay her debt, in full, right now, no installments. In return, she would work for him for 2 years. House manager, full autonomy over household matters, a salary of 3 silver coins a month, housing provided. Maeve looked at him. Her face went through 4 expressions in 10 seconds. Distrust, calculation, cautious hope, resolution. She agreed. Rain paid off her debt that very day. Maeve moved into the house the next morning, with a single bag of belongings and a habit of waking before dawn. By the end of the first week, the house had been transformed. Maeve had brought order that Rain, for all his efforts, could not achieve. Because Rain thought like an analyst, and Maeve thought like a manager. She didn't see numbers. She saw flows. Where to store the grain so it wouldn't get damp. How to distribute the firewood so it would last until spring. Which wall needed repair before the first frost. When to change the candles so they wouldn't be left in the dark. Little things, dozens of little things, which together transformed the house from a place where people survive into a place where people live. Maeve and Syrah hit it off within 3 days. Both were straightforward. Both were sparing with their words. Both respected competence. Maeve watched Syrah train and didn't ask a single question. Syrah watched Maeve run the household and didn't ask any questions either. They simply divided up the space. Syrah was in charge of the yard. Maeve was in charge of the house. The boundary ran along the threshold. Both of them respected it. Yuna's reaction was more complicated. The kitchen was her territory, the only place where she felt in control. The arrival of Maeve, who was used to running the entire household, created friction. Rain saw it before it became a problem. On the very first evening, he said one sentence to Maeve. "The kitchen belongs to Yuna." Maeve looked at him. She nodded. She didn't argue. She was smart enough to understand that this sentence wasn't about the kitchen. It was about boundaries, about the right to own a space, about something Yuna had been deprived of for 5 years. Maeve accepted the boundary and never crossed it, and a week later, Yuna herself invited her to try a new dish. Maeve tried it, said it was delicious. Yuna poured her some tea, that very tea. It was an invitation, unspoken but real. Maeve found it easiest to deal with Leanne. She didn't try to understand, didn't try to strike up a conversation. She just tidied up around her, made the bed, set the table, treated her as someone who had the right to remain silent. And by the end of the second week, Leanne would sometimes stand next to Maeve while she worked. She didn't help, she just stood there, watching, as if teaching herself how to be around people. In the 8th month, Rain received a letter, not from the Baron, from House Valmore. Short, formal. Knight Commander Aileen Valmore is heading to Calderon on an inspection mission. The purpose is to investigate reports of the illegal use of the Lunar Union by an unranked resident. Rain read the letter, set it aside, thought. The Baron's temple complaint.
He thought a legal loophole had closed the matter, but the Baron had gone higher up, not through the city temple, through the capital, through House Valmore, which controlled the royal guard. Rain didn't know who Eileen Valmore was. He couldn't judge from letters, only through people. He would know when he saw her. But one thing he knew for sure. 3 women lived in his house, along with Maeve, and each of them had a reason to fear people with coats of arms. Rain gathered everyone in the evening, for the first time, around one table, 5 people. Rain, Syrah, Una, Leanne, Maeve. He said that in a few days an inspector would arrive from the capital, a knight, high-ranking. He would verify the legality of the contracts. Rain said the contracts were legal, that he had checked every line, that there were no loopholes. But that the inspector wouldn't just look at the papers. The inspector would look at them, at how they live, at who they are. Una turned pale. Her hands began to tremble. Rain saw this and placed a cup of tea in front of her. Una took it, held it. The trembling subsided. Syrah placed her hand on her sword, not threateningly, out of habit, like placing a hand on a stair railing. Leanne hadn't changed. She looked at Rain and said nothing. Maeve asked what they should do. Rain replied, "Nothing. Live as you live. Cook, train, clean. Be yourselves. Because the best defense against an inspection is the truth. And the truth in this house was simple. 4 women and 1 man. A house that stands, walls that are warm, a sword that sings, a prayer that resounds, a notebook that grows. The truth, the only asset that never depreciates." Irene Valmore arrived in the 9th month. Rain stood by the window and saw the carriage stop at the gate. 1 carriage, 2 escorts, modest for a knight commander. She stepped out first, tall, straight back, dark hair pulled back, light traveling armor, sword on her left hip, precise movements, not a single superfluous gesture. Rain activated assessment. Irene Valmore, 28 years old, rank S, class, Knight Commander, absolute loyalty to the crown, personal conflict, suppressed, suppression level, critical, type of conflict, discrepancy between duty and convictions. Rain read it and paused on the last line. Discrepancy between duty and convictions. The Knight Commander of the Royal Guard had an inner rift, quiet, invisible from the outside, but the assessment saw everything. Irene entered the house without knocking, an inspector's right. She stopped in the doorway and surveyed the room. A table, the hearth, curtains, flowers on the windowsill, the smell of food, warm walls. Rain stood by the table. He bowed, not deeply, just enough for a non-ranked officer before an S rank, not a centimeter lower. Irene noticed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She was used to people bowing lower than they should, out of fear, out of obsequiousness. This one didn't bow lower. She said she was there on business, to verify the legality of the lunar union. She asked for documents. Rain laid them out on the table. 3 contracts, the deed to the house, a tax payment receipt, a copy of the original Moon Union law with a certified note regarding the clause that did not specify the bearer's rank. Irene read for 20 minutes, silently, carefully, every line, every seal, every date. Rain sat across from her and waited. He wasn't nervous. The documents were flawless. He had checked them so many times he could recite them from memory. Irene finished. She looked up. She said the documents were in order. Formally, there were no objections. But she had the right to inspect the living conditions and ensure that the contractual obligations were being fulfilled. Rain nodded. He offered to show her around the house. They walked through the first floor, the kitchen, the pantry, Rain's room by the door. Irene looked at his bed, a thin mattress on the floor, a blanket, a pillow. She looked at the door leading to the second floor, the latch on the other side. She didn't say anything, but Rain saw something had changed in her face, a millimeter-wide movement of her eyebrows. They went up to the second floor. 3 rooms, 3 beds, clean linens. Yuna has flowers and embroidery on the windowsill. Sierra's room is empty and tidy, just a sword hook on the wall. Leanne has a notebook on the table, open. Irene stopped by the notebook, read a few lines. Doesn't like mint, holds a spoon with her left hand. She falls asleep to the patter of rain. Her left eye is green in clear weather, blue in the rain. She smiled for the first time on the 47th day. Irene closed the notebook. She turned to Rain.
Her face was expressionless, but there was something in her eyes that Rain couldn't read through the assessment, because it wasn't a number. It was a feeling. She asked what it was. Rain answered. The entries. She asked why. Rain replied that Leanne doesn't remember her past, doesn't remember who she is, doesn't remember where she's from. The notebook is her present, the only proof that she exists, that someone sees her, not as a vessel, as a person. Irene was silent for 5 seconds, then she went downstairs. Rain followed her. Everyone was waiting in the main room, Sierra by the door, a sword at her belt, Yuna by the hearth, hands folded across her chest, Leanne by the window, Maeve at the table with the household records. Irene looked at each of them, for a long time, intently. She saw things that the assessment didn't show. She saw how Sierra stood, not like a captive, like a guard. She saw that Yuna wasn't averting her eyes. She saw that Leanne wasn't huddled in a corner, but standing by the open window. She saw that none of these women bore any signs of beatings or starvation or fear of the man beside them. She saw things she was used to not seeing in houses where men bought wives. Irene turned to Rain. She said the inspection was complete, no violations found. Rain nodded. He offered dinner. Because the road from the capital was long and the evening was cold, Irene accepted. They sat down at the table, 6 people. Yuna served the food, soup, bread, boiled vegetables. Simple, clean, filling. Rain poured tea, a different kind for each person. For Yuna, the one with jasmine and rosehip. For Seer, strong tea without sugar. For Leanne, warm water with honey because she didn't like tea but loved warmth. Maeve got green tea with mint. He poured Irene the usual, black. He set it in front of her. Irene picked up the cup, then she paused. She looked at the table, at the 4 different cups, at how Rain, without asking, had poured each person what they drank. Not one for everyone. Each had their own. Irene drank her tea and said nothing. No one spoke during dinner. It was quiet. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the presence of people who were used to being together, who didn't need to fill the air with words to feel that they weren't alone. Rain noticed that Irene was holding her right arm slightly lower than usual, her shoulder. A bruise or a strain. Fresh, from a fall. When Yuna passed the bread around the table and the basket reached Rain, he passed it to Irene. With his left hand, across the table, so she wouldn't have to reach with her right. Irene took the bread. She looked at Rain. 1 second. 2. Rain had already turned away. He was eating his soup. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't expecting thanks. He wasn't expecting a reaction. He just noticed that reaching with her right hand hurt her and passed it with his left. A small thing, insignificant, invisible to everyone except Irene. Because for 28 years, Irene had lived in a world where no one noticed that she was in pain. Because she was S-rank, a knight commander, the daughter of House Valmore, perfect, strong, the one who has no right to feel pain. And now at dinner, a rankless bastard passes her bread with his left hand. Irene finished eating. She stood up. She thanked him for dinner. Her voice was steady. Her face was calm. She walked out, got into the carriage, left that very night. Rain stood by the window and watched the carriage drive away. The system was silent. Irene wasn't part of the Lunar Union. She was something else. Rain didn't know what. But he knew one thing. She would return. Not by order, not out of duty, for the reason people returned to the place where they were first seen. Irene Valmore conducted an inspection and found no violations. She saw Leanne's notebook and how Rain cared for each woman individually.
During dinner, Rain passed her the bread with his left hand, noticing the bruise on her right shoulder. Irene left that same night. Rain is certain she will return. 9 months and 2 weeks. Night. Rain woke up thanks to his intuitive sense of danger. Not a needle, a blow, like a hammer to the back of the head. He jumped up. Darkness, silence. But his instincts were screaming. Rain went up to the second floor. He knocked on Sierra's door. She opened it instantly. She hadn't been sleeping. She felt it too. Not through the system, through her body, through a swordsman's instinct. Rain said one word. Guests. Sierra nodded, grabbed her sword, went out. Yuna stood in the hallway, pale, hands folded across her chest. A whisper, a prayer. The air thickened around her, a shield, weak, thin, but a shield. Maeve was already downstairs, crossbow in hand. She slept with a crossbow under her bed, a knight's widow's habit.
Leanne stood by the window on the second floor, staring into the darkness. Her eyes glowed, the left one blue, the right one gold, just like that night, but quieter, smoother, more controlled. Rain peered out into the courtyard, 4 figures at the gate. No, 6, 2 on the roof of the neighboring house, 8 people. His assessment kicked into high gear. Ranks from B to A-, professional killers, not mercenaries from a tavern, the elite, the employer, unidentified, disguised. But Rain didn't need the assessment to know. The Baron was tired of waiting. Rain went downstairs. He stepped out onto the porch, alone, unarmed, F rank, against 8 assassins. He spoke loudly so everyone could hear. He said there was an A-rank swordswoman in the house with inverted mana flow, a priestess with a holy shield, a manager with a crossbow and 20 years of experience, and one more he wouldn't mention, and that if any of the 8 crossed the threshold of the gate, he personally guaranteed that no one would return home. Silence. 10 seconds. One emerged from the darkness, tall, masked, A- rank, the squad leader. He asked how Rain knew how many of them there were. Ryan replied that he could see. The commander was silent. Then he said they had orders. Ryan said orders cost money and that he was asking for the last time how much they'd been paid. The commander named the sum, 50 silver. Ryan shook his head. Cheap. 8 professionals at 6 silver a man. The Baron hadn't skimped. The Baron was broke. 50 silver was all he could afford. Ryan said he wouldn't pay anymore, not this time. This time he was offering something else. He was offering a fight, one-on-one, his best fighter against their best. If Ryan won, they'd leave and tell the employer the job was impossible. If they won, Ryan would open the gates. The commander looked at him. Then he turned to his men. A brief exchange of gestures. A nod. He agreed. Because it was fairer and safer than storming a house with unknowns inside. One man stepped out of the group, the largest, rank A-, 2 short blades, the stance of a close-quarters killer. Sierra stepped out onto the platform, sword in hand, calm. She stood and waited. Her breathing was steady, feet shoulder-width apart, little finger in the hollow of the hilt. Her body remembered. Her body knew. The assassin moved first. Quickly, 2 blades fanned out, left to the throat, right to the ribs. A standard combination to break the guard. Sierra made a single move, a step to the left, blade up, a diagonal strike from the shoulder. Inversion of the flow. Mana flowed from the sword to her heart and back. The strike doubled. The blade passed through both of the assassin's short swords, through his guard, through the air in front of him, and stopped a centimeter from his throat. She didn't kill him. She stopped, consciously, controlled, because before the fight, Rain had said one word to her. Alive. The assassin stood motionless. Both his blades lay on the ground, cleaved in 2, cleanly, evenly, like paper with scissors. One strike. One. The arena was silent for 3 seconds. Then the squad leader took off his mask.
A young face, a scar across his eyebrow. He looked at Sira, at the severed blades, at the sword pressed against his fighter's throat. He turned to Rain, said the mission was impossible. Rain nodded. The commander gestured for the team to withdraw. They left, disappeared into the darkness, quietly, professionally, just as they had arrived. Rain exhaled. He entered the house, sat down at the table. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from what happened next. Yuna approached him first. She set down the tea, that very one, with jasmine, but not for herself, for him. For the first time in 9 months, she poured him tea to his taste, not hers, his. Rain didn't drink jasmine tea. He drank black tea, no sugar. Yuna knew that. Yuna remembered. She made him his tea. Rain looked at the cup, then at Yuna. Yuna wasn't looking at him. She was washing the teapot. But the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. Precision. She understood. She had learned. Not from the system. From Rain. Maeve was putting away the crossbow. Her hands were steady. She looked at Rain and winked, for the first time, like someone who knows the worst is behind them. Lien came down from upstairs. Her eyes were normal. The glow had faded. She walked over to the table, opened the notebook, that very one, picked up a pen, and for the first time ever, wrote in it herself. A single line. Rain didn't read it right away. He read it in the morning when everyone was asleep. The line was in a language he didn't know, but the assessment translated it. Home. Rain closed the notebook. He placed it on the table. He pressed his palm against the cover. He sat like that for a minute. Connection 187 out of 1,000. A spike. Rain didn't look at the numbers. He looked at the notebook and thought about how 2 words written by a stranger's hand in his notebook were worth more than all of Calderon's silver. In the morning, Rain made a decision. Enough of playing defense. Enough of waiting. Enough of buying up small debts one by one. It was time to close the position. He went to Braun, sat down at the table, laid out his plan. He needed 400 silver, fast, in a month. Braun choked on his tea. 400 silver in a month is the turnover of a major trading guild, not a jewelry shop. Rain said he knew, and that he had an idea. In 3 weeks, Calderon would host its annual fair. Merchants from across the kingdom. Houses stock up for 6 months in advance. Demand for artifacts and stones quadruples. Rain had spent the last month tracking down hidden assets all over the city. Stones, artifacts, runic items. Things that lay on shop counters and in basements and cost pennies because no one understood their true value. Rain understood. He compiled a list of 43 items. Total purchase cost, 60 silver. Total selling price to the right buyer, over 500. Braun looked at the list, at the numbers, at Rain. He shook his head, but not in disagreement, at the scale of it. They got to work. The fair lasted 5 days. Rain worked all 5, from dawn until midnight, Braun by his side. Maeve kept the books, 43 items, each sold to the right buyer at the right price at the right moment. Not all at once, in batches. On the first day, Rain sold 5 entry-level artifacts, 20 silver, small change, a warm-up. On the second day, water mana stones, 35. The House of Velenor bought 3 for their ceremonial hall. On the third day, rune belts and amulets, 40. On the fourth day, a single item, a moon pearl necklace that had been lying at the bottom of the antique dealer's widow's chest and which the widow had considered mere trinketry. Rain bought it for 2 silver. He sold it to a representative of the House of Sorrentis for 120. Because moon pearls enhanced fertility rituals, and the House of Sorrentis had been unable to produce an heir for 3 years. To them, that necklace was worth far more than 120 silver. It was worth the future of their line. Day 5. The remaining items, 80 silver, total for 5 days, 295 silver in net profit after deducting purchase costs. Braun sat poring over the ledger and couldn't speak. 295 silver in 5 days. His shop made 100 in its best year. Rain took his share. 200 silver exactly. Plus the 140 he'd saved up over the last few months. Plus the 40 that Maeve had squeezed out of the household by saving on everything except food. Total, 380. It wasn't enough. 20 silver short of fully covering all of Ashgrave House's debts. Rain sat at the table and counted. He ran through the options, and then there was a knock at the door. Maeve opened it. Cale was standing in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood the Ashgrave estate manager, the very same one to whom Rain had sold 3 small debts months ago. The manager entered. He sat down. He placed a small pouch on the table. Rain looked at it. 20 silver. The manager said it wasn't a gift, it was a purchase. He was buying one thing from Rain, a guarantee that when Rain took control of the Ashgrave house, the steward would keep his job. Rain looked at him. The steward knew. He saw what was happening. He saw how small debts were flowing from the Baron's hands into the bastards. He saw the numbers. Not like Rain, but enough. And he placed a bet on the winner. Rain took 20 silver. He nodded. The steward left. 400 silver. Exactly. For the next 2 weeks, Rain bought up the debts, methodically, one by one. Every creditor was happy to get the money now instead of the Baron's promises of someday. By the end of the 2nd week, every IOU from House Ashgrave in Calderon and the surrounding area lay in a drawer in Rain Ashgrave's desk. 480 silver in debt. An entire house. On paper. Rain sent the Baron a note, a short one, 1 line. I'll be waiting tomorrow. Your house or my terms. The Baron came, not to the inn, to Rain's house for the first time. He walked in and stopped, looked around, at the warm walls, at the flowers, at the curtains, at the kitchen which smelled of fresh bread, at the sword on the hook by the door, at the woman by the hearth who didn't turn her head, at the other one by the gate who looked at him the way a predator looks at someone who has entered its territory. The Baron sat down at the table across from Rain. Rain placed a stack of receipts in front of him, 23 of them, 480 silver, the Ashgrave house's total debt. The Baron stared at the stack. His face was stony, but the assessment showed critical stress, physical condition deteriorating, manic exhaustion progressing, estimated duration adjusted, 2 years, not 3. Rain spoke evenly. He said he would not take the house. He would not demand repayment. He would not disgrace the Ashgrave name before the kingdom. He wanted one thing, the same as the first time. His mother's name, out loud, before witnesses. The Baron was silent. A minute, 2, 3. His hands lay on the table. His fingers didn't move, but the vein in his temple throbbed, fast, hard. Then he spoke. His voice was hoarse, old. He said the name. Ilara Nims, a servant girl from a northern village. Rain heard that name for the first time. The old Rain didn't know his mother's name. No one had ever said it. Ilara Nims. He repeated it to himself, memorized it. Forever. The Baron had said it in front of witnesses. Maeve stood by the wall with a quill and paper. She wrote it down. The date, time, name, witness's signature. Una heard from the kitchen, Sira from the doorway, Leanne from upstairs. Everyone heard. The Baron stood up. He looked at Rain. Their eyes met. The same gray eyes, father and son. 24 years of silence. One name, uttered with great effort, through shame, through fear, but uttered nonetheless. The Baron left. Rain sat at the table. He didn't move. The receipts lay before him. He could destroy them. He could return them. He could keep them as leverage. He chose the third option, not out of revenge, out of calculation. The debts remained his insurance, as long as the Baron lives, as long as House Ashgrave exists, as long as there are those who want to wipe out the younger line. Rain put the receipts in a drawer. He closed it. Evening. Home. Silence. Una set tea before him. Black, no sugar. His tea. Rain took the cup. He drank. He was silent. Then he said a name. Ilara. He simply said it, out loud, in his own home, to himself. Una heard. Maeve heard. Sarah heard it at the door. His mother's name spoken by her son in the house he had built from 9 copper coins. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It was justice. Quiet. Simple. Real. That night, Rain didn't sleep. He went out onto the porch. The sky was clear. Stars. Cold air. The north. Where out there in the north, beyond the mountains and forests, lay the rift, a crack in the world. The temple remembered every rumor and every report about it. The land around the rift yields no crops. Mana drains away. Villages are emptying. The temple sends expeditions. The expeditions do not return. Rain stood on the porch and looked north and felt something. Not a threat. His skill was silent. Something else. An attraction, like a magnet, as if something in the north was calling. Not him, something inside him. He turned around. Leanne was standing in the doorway, barefoot, silver hair in the moonlight, eyes of different colors, both glowing, quiet, evenly. She was looking north too. Rain asked if she felt it. Leanne nodded. Rain asked what it was. Leanne answered. She said one word. The beginning. Rain looked at her, at the stars, at the north. He thought of the 480 silver coins in the desk drawer, about the sword that sings in Sira's hand, about the prayer that warms the walls, about the notebook in which a stranger's hand wrote, "My home," about the red-haired woman with a crossbow who runs the household so that every coin works, about the gnome jeweler who started with a single ring and now runs the best shop in town, about the scout who treats his wife for honest money, about the knight commander who left at night and didn't sleep until morning, about everything that grew from 9 copper coins and a tattered cloak. A year. 1 year. 12 months. And here he stands on the porch of his own home. Behind him, the people who chose to stay are sleeping, not because of a contract, because of something greater. And ahead lies the north, the rift, a crack in the world, the continent's most underrated asset. Whoever seals the rift will rewrite the rules of mana for all of Valemore. Rain knew this was the next step. Not in a month, not in a week. Soon. Because Leanne had said the beginning, and because her eyes were shining, and because his intuitive sense of danger was silent. Which meant the north wasn't a danger. The north was an opportunity. Rain turned to Leanne. He said that in the morning they would gather at the table and talk. That was it. About what came next. Leanne nodded. She went inside. Rain stayed on the porch for another minute. He looked up at the sky. He smiled. That very smile. Not with his face, with that place inside where, for 38 plus 24 years, a single, simple faith had lived. There is always hidden value. You just have to know how to see it. He went inside, closed the door, lay down, fell asleep. For the first time in a year, not by the door, on the bed, because Sira was standing by the door, with a sword, by her own choice. System. Connection 342 of 1000. Progress is steady. The journey continues. End of the first arc.